Hello and welcome to On Geopolitics, the podcast that looks at geopolitics in historical context with myself, Ali Ansari, and my colleague, Suzanne Rain. It's been an eventful summer, hasn't it, Suzanne?
Yes, Ali, we've had a couple of months off, but the world very much didn't stop. So for this first podcast of the Michaelmas term, we thought what we would do was have a quick run through of the events that have happened over the summer, many of which are still unfolding. And then we would look at the question, what is going to happen next? And we're going to do that not just by giving our predictions and forecasts, but actually by talking about the question, what's going to happen next? And looking at different ways that you might think about or answer that question when it comes to how geopolitics is going to play out. In terms of where we're going to focus, if we look at the sort of critical areas, clearly all eyes are on the conflict in Ukraine that's happened because Russia has invaded. That's taken an unexpected turn, or a turn that was unexpected by many over the summer, because we've seen really significant success in Ukrainian counteroffensives, particularly in the north and east, less so in the south, where it's been much slower. And then we've seen there was a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Samarkand in September, where it became really evident, I think, that Putin was in difficulties. He wasn't getting the
He didn't look comfortable, did he?
He wasn't getting the unequivocal support from China that I think he would have wanted. And both China and India really cleverly saying lots of ambiguous things about respecting territorial integrity and not being a time for war. And as a result of that, he's clearly come back and thought, I need to do something to bring this to a head. This can't go on. And he's launched the mobilization, which we're seeing in Russia at the moment. And it isn't at all clear how that's going to play out. And we can talk about that some more. Meanwhile, of course, in Iran, a subject much
close to my heart, yes.
Again, I think if you'd said in June that by this time, at the end of September, we would be talking about protests on the streets across most cities in Iran, you would not have said that was going to happen, or would you?
No, not at all. Well, I mean, there's been regular protests. And I think on the one hand, people ask me now, they say, how expected was this? How, could we have predicted it? I don't think we could have accurately predicted when it was going to happen. But, clearly protests have been happening in the Islamic Republic quite regularly. And we know that there's been a very strict imposition of the dress codes on women in particular in Iran, obviously, over the last 9 months. And there's been some pretty heavy-handed brutality meted out to women. To my mind, it was only a matter of time before you had a fatality. But yes, the scale and nature of the protest has obviously taken all of us a little bit by surprise. And of course, the question everyone asks is, where does it go from here? And this is the eternal question.
It is the eternal. And of course, we can all remember similar occasions in the past in Iran, which have, everyone said, there's going to be some kind of counter-revolution, I suppose you call it.
Yeah.
And then it's been suppressed or it's petered out in some other way. So again, it's always really hard to work out whether this is the turning point or whether this is just another one of the turning points which didn't turn out to be a turning point. And then just carrying on with a little list, we have obviously also had escalating tensions in between China and Taiwan, which is drawing in the other countries, particularly Japan, in that area. And attention is focusing on China now because on the 16th of October, it will be the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. So the kind of big question is, will President Xi be granted his third term? I think there is little doubt that he will. Professor Bill Hurst, Bill from Deputy Director of the Centre for Geopolitics, has written a piece for the Centre's website this week, giving his predictions of how that's likely to play out. In both China and Russia, there's a really interesting generational question because Xi is 69, President Putin is 70, I think he's 70. So they are now getting older. As we all know, Ali, you may disagree, but I think that as as men get older, they get a little bit angrier and a little bit more intent on achieving their objectives. But there is also that question about the next generation. So the next generation down are 50-year-olds whose time has probably come. So how do they manage that shift
or transition?
Yeah, because there has to be a transition.
Fortunately, in Iran, we have no sort of age requirement. They seem to go on and on until really they reach their natural end, I think.
Which is another question, I think, because the Ayatollah is not well.
No, that's right. He's not well. And I mean, he's in his 80s. And, the succession issue is something that's going to be very, we've discussed that before in previous podcasts. But I think things are generally coming to a head, which is quite interesting.
So what we thought we would do today is, rather than give answers to all these uncertainties, we would discuss the means by which one seeks to provide answers to uncertainties.
That's
or
right.
Even better, the means by which one accepts that there are uncertainties and learns how to adapt oneself to the uncertainties, with a view to making things essentially pan out more like we want them to than they might otherwise.
How we can be better prepared, I suppose, is
how
the
we
idea.
Can be better prepared for whatever happens next. And ideally, well, no, because that's still passive. Ideally, how we can somehow change what happens next so that it's less bad.
Yeah,
that's the
good point.
Absurdly ambitious objective of this podcast. And Ali, I think you're going to start, aren't you, by talking about how you do that using history?
Yes. I mean, I was going to look at it from obviously a historian's perspective. Of course, historians are famous for saying that, we don't do predictions. It's much safer not doing predictions, because most often than not, it turns out wrong. But as you say, it's a question of really laying out what we imagine would be scenarios going forward and what we think would be realistic outcomes. So, policy planners and others can be a little bit better, more better prepared for what's coming. And I think one of the interesting things for me, I suppose, in any historical experience, is that we always tend to be fighting the last war, don't we? We always tend to look at, so everyone sort of looks at the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979 and expects a repeat of that performance, almost sort of carbon copy, which of course is just not going to happen. I mean, that's just not the way things happen. I mean, And Iran has many popular political other uprisings that you can choose from. And I think, and I often say that if you look back a bit further, to paraphrase, I think it's Churchill, isn't it? It says the further back you look, the further forward you can project. Nice little phrase, that. And I'm
not sure how maybe,
but it's very useful for historians, you see, because it means medieval historians can be very, very, very useful all of a sudden. But for me, certainly, the bigger the context, the bigger the sort of historical landscape you can explore, the better an idea you might have. And again, these are very sort of conditional sort of issues, but the better idea you might have of potential ways forward. And if you in Iran in particular, I've written about this, if you look at the various different historical and even sort of literary examples of popular revolt, not just Muslim ones, but Iranian sort of narratives and others, it gives you a slightly different idea about how people might behave. So that's one thing. And then, of course, being, as the other phrase that I very much like, the archaeology of knowledge, as a French thinker, I think once said. We're always sort of picking, our problem is that we have limited evidence, don't we? We don't have full information, all the information we want. We never have all the information we want. So we're sort of filling in the gaps. So the way I've tried to do it in looking at Iran is bringing together both an understanding of the historical experience and then filling the gaps with certain conceptual sort of models of how states change and political change, economic change. And that's the way I suppose I come to a conclusion and some thoughts about where Iran may or may not go. But of course, it requires, I suppose, that thing which, I think we all need to be a little bit braver about, and that's sort of unorthodox thinking, I suppose, thinking out the box and not being dictated by certain, I don't know, standard narratives of historical development that, that we think apply. I mean, I remember having debates with colleagues who were essentially social scientists, I should say, not to be rude about social scientists, but had a sort of a tick box model of what is required for a state to change. And of course, some of this might be useful. Of course, it's a useful framework of how to think, but I don't think it should necessarily dictate, because, all these models clearly change when we look at the experience. I mean, I don't know how, I don't know what you've obviously had a much more hands-on, and, you're much more in a policy framework. So I'd love to know how you sort of were able to try and handle these things.
Well, I think you've that last point is a really interesting one. Essentially, how do you predict instability or a spontaneous, when will a spontaneous movement of people become something which then does change the government of a country, I suppose, or change, how does a revolution happen? And if you read actually John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, which is about the Russian Revolution, he was there at the time. Nothing was fixed at the start of those 10 days. Lenin wasn't even, was it Trotsky? No, I'm confused. One of them wasn't even in the country and had to sort of rush back. And one of them, sorry, I really should know, but there was so many competing revolutionary organizations. They really didn't know that this was the moment, but they thought, if this is the moment, let's seize it. And they just managed to get that momentum that carried them through. And I think we used to look always at countries of risk of instability in my former life and say, well, let's look across the world and where do we think is most unstable? That was never really a very good way of looking, even if you had a whole load of different indices. But if you're looking for instability, it was actually the Americans had said to me, don't forget that the strongest regimes, the most rigid countries are also the most brittle. And so you can be essentially a chaotic country, so permanently unstable, but stable in your permanent instability. And there's lots of countries like that, one might even say. But there are these strongly authoritarian regimes which are brittle at a certain moment. And so they will then suddenly break. And the way that they break is so dramatic. So you could argue, this may be controversial, but you could argue that one of the reasons that what happened after the US and its allies invaded Iraq in 2003, the reason that Iraq collapsed so completely and was impossible to put back together was precisely because Saddam Hussein's rule had been so authoritarian that all the governance structures collapsed and it couldn't be put back together again. So we're looking, essentially, we're now talking about particularly Russia and Iran, where we are now seeing, actually more in Iran than in Russia, but we're seeing kind of popular mobilization, young people on the streets. And we're saying, is this a tipping point? Might something be different? And it's, as you just said, it's impossible to know from this point what's going to happen next. You've written, though, very interestingly for Engelsberg Ideas this week, where you do actually, I mean, in a way you hedge your bets still, but you do say this is the start of something, don't you?
Well, I mean, where I cheat a bit, I have to say, is that, I've been thinking that the situation in the Islamic Republic has been unsustainable for some time. So it's not even so much. I think the current situation is the start of anything. I think it's just a sort of a continuation down a path that has a logical conclusion, which is not very, which is not in the Islamic Republic's favor, if I can put it that way. That's not to say that the immediate outcome of what's going to happen of the current protests is going to result in anything pleasant. I mean, I think I also say in that there may be light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a very long tunnel. Yeah. And I think, people have to be aware of that, because there's a lot of excitement, I think, certainly among opposition groups, certainly abroad and others who feel that something imminent is about to happen. And I think we have to be a little bit more, wary of what history tells us. The demonstrations in 2009 that were vast after the sort of the highly contentious and, in my view, fraudulent election of 2009 resulted in demonstrations over a period of 6 months, very widespread, very violent as far as we could see. And yet ultimately they petered out and they were contained. Now, the difference, I think, now is that, the popular protest is not really about political reform. I mean, I think by the end of the protests in 2009, people had moved away from the belief that the Islamic Republic was capable of internal reform. But certainly that was a process. I mean, that was a process that took place over the 6 months. I think now people have entered into the demonstrations with the view that they don't like what they see, and they're arguing for change. The trouble is, of course, is that, how politically organized these protests are. I mean, I also wrote a piece about, how the British in particular assess the fall of the Shah, in 1978. And it's fascinating to see actually how, when you look at the dispatches coming from the British Embassy in Tehran back to the Foreign Office, through 78, how it only really very slowly dawned on people that something significant politically was taking shape. We tend to read in history books now. It's a bit of a cliche, and I hate it, to be honest, but it's a cliche. They say, the Islamic Revolution in Iran began on the 8th of January, 1978, with an article in a newspaper, blah, 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 blah. And it's all very neat and tidy and rather nice. Of course, the interesting thing is when you look at the contemporary documents, nobody noticed. I mean, nobody gave two hoots about this. I mean, some people know, but they didn't think it was significant. What is it? How do we, in a sense, as analysts, really looking at this in real time, decide what is significant and what isn't? And that for me is fascinating. That's why I think, I always say to colleagues who are more in the policy side of things that we shouldn't kick ourselves for not predicting things, because revolutions are inherently unpredictable. I mean, otherwise, if we could always predict them, at least cleanly, let's say, it wouldn't be the surprise that, the revolutionary surprise that it is.
Obviously, Ali, this is a subject close to my heart.
Yes, absolutely.
You know that I think that we are in thrall to prediction and forecasting.
Yeah.
And my personal view is that the Philip Tetlock super forecasting thing, where essentially you can set a computer game, you bring people together in an abstract way and ask them a whole set of questions about what the future is going to look like. And some people are better at it than others. Is a terrible way to go about it, if I'm honest, because it's almost saying everything can somehow be reduced to an algorithm. And of course, the really unpredictable things are never going to be thrown up by the algorithm, because the algorithm is working on the basis of patterns that it's seen before.
That's right.
So you have to find a way. So for me, I would love it if we could stop talking about predicting and forecasting and horizon scanning. To me, it's no good saying, what's Iran going to look like in 5 years' time?
Right.
We have no idea. It's a waste of time trying to say. What would be better to do is essentially what you're talking about, which is monitoring it on a daily basis and investing in the people who are watching how it's changing on a daily basis, so that exactly as you're saying, exactly at that point where something happens, it's not that nobody's noticed it, when you go back and nobody really realized what was happening, because you actually have a whole load of people who are noticing it and talking about it and trying to work out what it means all the time. And I think what's changed in the modern age is that we kind of do have that. We have this massive open source thing particularly on Twitter, where people are analyzing everything. But they're still stuck in, they're either analysing without any ability to do anything about anything. So you want to be able to make sure that analysis is feeding back into the people who could decide something. Or they're analysing still in this sort of passive vacuum, so to say, well, let's predict what's going to happen next. And my what I like to think is my killer point is that obviously nothing in the future is fixed. So what happens next depends not only on, it's not enough just to say, what is Putin going to do? But we should also be saying, what are the actions that others might take that will affect what Putin does? And that, of course, includes the actions of whatever amalgam of actors you want to say. The West, is that the EU? Is it NATO? Is it America? Is it individual nations doing different things? It's also actions that China and India and the Middle East might take vis-a-vis Russia in terms of the support they're giving or the messages that they're sending. All of those things affect what happens next. So a suggestion that you can just conjure out of thin air a prediction is lunacy. From my
no, I mean, I think it's an excellent point. No, it's an excellent point, because Because one is that we don't, and so what I do is basically I look at a particular environment, and obviously I'm looking at Iran. I mean, other people will be looking at Russia, Ukraine, other things, China, what the hell is China being up to? And we tend to look at these in a very sort of isolated manner without really looking at all the host of other events and interventions or non-interventions, if you will, that might affect that. And I think that's quite right. I mean, I don't, in that sense, you're highlighting, I think, something which is very important, and which I think some of my colleagues might digest a bit better, is just the sheer complexity of this process of working out what might not happen. And I agree that this idea of forecast, I found it very frustrating where people sort of like, certainly, for instance, after the revolution in Iran, there was a huge amount of sort of self-reflection. I mean, the Americans were constantly sort of beating themselves up about how we didn't predict it, we didn't do that. And I think that, there is room, as I think, obviously we did in this country with the Brown report on the lessons of the Islamic Revolution. There's obviously a huge amount of room for reflection and seeing what can be done better. But I don't think there's much merit in kicking yourself for not actually having predicted it. What you can do is just improve the processes, I suppose, as you say, where you're able to assess it. And one of the things that I suppose I've thought about, and I'm thinking off the top of my head here, really, but you're talking about how this continuous analysis with digital media and social media and others. But I suppose in one way, one of the things that worries me is that actually we're not getting as much thoughtful analysis as we might, because everyone's in a rush to get some sort of point out. Everyone wants to sort of like sort of know what's going to happen, and it's all a bit too rapid fire, isn't it? I mean, the next week, things could change again, and you'll suddenly find that op-ed or whatever that was written, or that comment is reversed. It's got a very short shelf life, unfortunately.
Well, I've been writing quite a lot, and I, having come from a government assessment background,
That's
my
right.
strongly held view is that all nations and all organizations of nations with a shared objective need to properly invest in the bit at the center which does the thinking.
Yeah.
And that is, I mean, actually, banks have it in different ways because they think about different things, but governments have it. They have assessment and analysis capabilities. They tend to be not terribly well understood and under-resourced. But as you're saying, if things are changing so quickly all over the place, you have to have a means by which you receive your information into one place. You sort it, you filter it, and you think about it, and you track how things are changing, because you can only spot the sort of outlier event that's a clue that something's going to happen. You can only spot that if you're tracking all the other events. So there isn't a shortcut to doing that. You have to invest in assessment and analysis, which is watching everything, and can then say, oh, that thing which happened last week in Irkutsk, for example, random example, that's an outlier. That might mean something. And then you start to watch it and you say, well, what might it mean? And what might be the other things that we can look for that might also give us a clue that something's happening? And then you can start also to have the conversation which says, if these things are happening, what might we do that might change what's happening in a way, affect it in a way that we think is the right way to affect it? And obviously that's a whole nother debate. But I found, I'm going to give you a little example because I think people get really muddled.
Yeah.
And the example about why collectively the West, the EU, didn't act before Russia invaded Ukraine, or it didn't really act, it talked a bit, but it didn't really act, is a really interesting one, because essentially you did have, from October, November last year, you had, particularly from the US and UK, you had briefings saying Vladimir Putin's going to invade Ukraine. And they went to the EU, they showed them all sorts of information. I have no special knowledge about that, but there's a nice story in Bloomberg which reported that the US had briefed the EU that Russia was considering an invasion of Ukraine. And the briefing was based on information which had not been shared with European governments. Yeah. And the EU said that this information would have to be shared before any decision could be taken on a collective response. So immediately you have this difficulty of building baseline understanding of what the threat might be, because it's inconceivable that the Americans are going to say, right, well, we're going to share with 27 countries
Absolutely.
some really sensitive information. But the fact that you can't even persuade closest allies to accept your word, it is a problem in terms of then forming a basis for what you're going to do next. And I think that the confusion at the heart of this is that people are mistrustful of American or British intelligence because they say, well, you were wrong before in Iraq, or you might have another motive, therefore. But that's confusing two completely separate concepts.
Yeah.
Because the question on Iraq was, does Saddam Hussein have weapons of mass destruction? To which the answer is yes or no.
Yeah, it's a very factual.
It's a very factual. Yeah. It's an assertion of an already existing state of affairs. The question on will Vladimir Putin invade Ukraine is a question of intent. So we know what his capabilities are. The question is he going to do it? So this is why, for me, predicting and forecasting are so unhelpful, because the question comes down to whether or not we believe that it's a possibility. And if we believe it's a possibility, then we need to consider what we're going to do now to stop it from happening.
Yeah.
So, and that would have to be an effective deterrent response, so which would change Putin's risk calculus. So there was nowhere I could see in October and November last year where there was a proper conversation before it happened that said, what would we need to do to stop it happening? And so the West then became, as it always is, I'm afraid, I believe, essentially a responsive actor. So it responds to things that have been done by others rather than setting those. And I think it is precisely because we are enthralled to forecasting and prediction rather than action.
But didn't it reflect, perhaps, another thing, that there was a narrative, an embedded narrative in a way in a number of European capitals that built over, I don't know, decades, I suppose, maybe two decades, that essentially, this policy of hugging Russia close was the right way to go. And therefore, the evidence that Putin might, invade Ukraine was going to completely shatter this model that they built up. So I suppose in some ways, the intelligence was forcing them rather awkwardly to review a sort of a well-embedded sort of understanding. That was their, not so much intelligence, but a perspective, a very well-embedded sort of policy perspective that they had.
Yes, I suppose you could say, when my question, if we believe that this is a possibility, what do we need to, and I suppose what you're saying is that such was the strongly held beliefs of something else, that it simply wasn't possible to persuade people that it was a possibility. But then that says not very many good things about the shared understanding of the threat at that time across Europe. We were talking yesterday, Ali, you and I were at a conference at the Changing Character of War Centre in Oxford, which was really interesting. And I thought there was a fascinating, an insight that I hadn't really fully factored in from Dima Adamski, who said, Russia has invested its thought into how best to inflict a surprise on an enemy and less on how to recover from surprises.
Yeah,
and that's what we're seeing now.
Yeah,
so,
really
Russia's reeling because it's not very adaptive. And my observation was that the West, essentially, by which I mean, the UK, US, the Anglosphere, the EU, does the opposite. So it's very rare for us, through our transparent, consensus-based decision-making processes, to take a decision to do something unexpected or surprising. And in fact, we feel we feel really uncomfortable with ourselves when we do, such as the AUKUS deal. There was a huge backlash because we'd done something that had surprised the French, which is just not done.
I know.
But what actually, and then I was thinking about it a little more, I think conversely, we are much better at responding. So we are more adaptive to surprises. So we might not be the surprisers, but we're better at, when we are surprised, we're so used to being surprised that we have actually evolved a system which enables us to respond in a more agile way. But it struck me that is a psychological difference. And Shashank Joshi was asking last night, if there's a debate at the moment about whether Russia might decide to use a tactical nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
And Shashank was asking, given this Russian sort of tactical behavior, essentially to surprise rather than, maybe we're thinking about it all wrong because we're constantly trying to look for the next escalatory step. But maybe we should just be prepared for the fact that their MO is to surprise us. So we might not get all the information that we might need before something happens. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I think that's probably right. I mean, of course, they have the advantage of, autocratic or authoritarian systems have the advantage of being able to keep things a little bit more shielded than we might have. I mean, I think our problem in the West is the abundance of leaks, to be honest. I mean, it's so difficult to keep things actually really under wraps for very long. And as you quite rightly say, the experience of AUKUS, which is basically it was a military commercial deal. I mean, it wasn't, we weren't doing anything too dramatic. And yet, people were quite shocked, that we should be keeping this sort of under commercial wraps or whatever. But I think that's definitely an issue. And of course, what people like Putin and others can do is by playing on this issue of surprise is leverage a huge amount, against us in a sense, because what weaknesses they have, they can maximize it by basically not letting us know what they might do or strike next. So it's much more in a sense, they have a degree of agility that we don't have, and that makes life more complicated. I mean, the other thing I wanted to say, from my example, is that the experience of Iran certainly is, as you say, this sort of idea of belief and understanding. I mean, I've been quite struck, for instance, that even this week, the level of surprise there's been among people about, what's going on in Iran and the way women are treated. I mean, I was very surprised to find that a number of people were quite shocked, that women were treated badly in Iran. And I did think to myself, how is that? And of course, I think for a good, 8 years, people have, certainly those who don't spend a huge amount of time looking at Iran, have been, the face of Iran has been, the very loquacious Javad Zarif, and others who speak very fluently, and others, and engage very constructively in some ways with their Western interlocutors, and that's the image they gain. So therefore, it didn't really click to them that actually what you're seeing in Iran is a regime that's actually, for want of a better term, is actually pretty misogynistic. I mean, it's not, this is not a sort of a liberal country, and certainly not in its current configuration. So it's, it was interesting, sort of puncturing some of the assumptions which people had built up, certain narratives. And that had framed their understanding. So when the evidence came to the contrary, it took a bit of time for them to adjust. And I suspect this was the same, really. I mean, it was a really major issue to realize that Putin was perhaps not the warm, cuddly Russian that we thought he might be. I mean, I know a lot of people obviously realized he wasn't, but they didn't really accept how far he might go. Apart from, it has to be said, Eastern Europeans who were fairly on the ball, I have to say, weren't they? I mean, they know they're on the front line.
Their perspective is very different because they've lived. I mean, the thing that we've learnt, Ali, that Ukraine has brought home to us all so vividly is the relevance of history to what happens now.
Yeah.
And I've been really struck through conversations with Europeans this summer of all shapes and sizes of how much it's made them think about their own families, journey through the 20th century. And of course, we're the people alive now. We don't remember the Second World War. We don't remember all of this, but we've all got a sense of where we were rooted in it. And that does, even if you really consciously don't want it to, it does nonetheless give you a sense of where your feet should be now. Yeah. And I think that's why it's so difficult in Germany, the debate is so difficult because they genuinely still are trying to work out all of those issues, trying to really, it's only been 30 years since unification. The people who lived in East Germany had a very, very different relationship with Russia, different. So that question that you're raising now is like, how do you understand what has become the enemy or the adversary. And I think Elizabeth Braw wrote something really interesting, saying, there's an awful lot of people in East Germany who understand Russia, who went on study exchanges when they're at school, they really understand Russia, but in a different way. And so we're all trying to work all of that out, and it's not straightforward. But I suppose all I would say is let's not try and work it out by just sitting there saying, what do we predict is going to happen next? Can I finish with a observation about the future? Absolutely. I suppose. So, and this is the paradox of good prediction. So, good prediction will always seem to be wrong because nothing in the future is fixed.
Right.
And the best analysis, if you're doing this properly, enables swift decisions which change the outcome. So the best, if a prediction takes the shape of a warning, essentially a warning of something bad rather than something good. But if you're trying to warn that something might happen, the best predictions look like false alarms because they have been fed into a decision-making process that then has a proper conversation about what action needs to be taken to stop it happening. So then it doesn't happen. And then you can say, well, you were wrong when you said that Russia was going to collapse because it didn't, or whatever it is. And on Ukraine, so all the predictions which say, is Ukraine going to take more territory or not? Is it going to be a bloody stalemate or not? Actually, action taken by Ukraine and the degree of useful support it receives will determine exactly how far and how quickly Russia can be pushed back. So you get sort of military analysis, which is providing situation updates, which enable these adjustments. And you have observation and intelligence, which indicate what are Russia's strategic vulnerabilities. And you have diplomatic reporting and security partnerships, which give insight into the posture of allied countries. And then you need to think, well, now we know where we are. What do we need to do to change what happens next? And, I think we should be aiming for something where alliances of countries are greater than the sum of their parts, so that they are thinking collectively, so they are capable of taking collective action, which then does essentially change the outcome, which in this case, obviously, I would argue, involve providing more support to Ukraine now to get ahead of the Russian mobilization when that starts really to kick in, which will be next spring.
Well, I think that's a good way to end this return to the On Geopolitics podcast. But I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed that, and I hope we can maybe with the help of guests going forward, maybe discuss this, in a little further and explore the different ways in which we can perhaps enhance capabilities and so on and so forth, as you sort of outlined now. I think it's a fascinating part.
I'm going to predict, Ali, that it's going to be an exciting autumn.
Right.
And maybe that's a terrible word. It's going to be an eventful autumn. And we need to be on our guard.
In more ways than one.
Watching constantly, observing and ready.
I think that's absolutely right. And I hope our listeners will accompany us while we explore some of these things. So until next time, it's bye from me.
And goodbye from me.